with houses spread far apart and an almost unnatural calmness in the air. The house I bought wasn't big, but it was nice enough for me. I didn't know anyone before moving there, and since I wasn't exactly a social person, I mostly kept to myself. Only a few days after I moved in, I heard a knock at my front door. I was still unpacking, but I went to answer it. Standing there was a tall, older man with gray-streaked hair and a patchy beard. He introduced himself as Martin, a neighbor who lived a few doors down. He said he just wanted to welcome me to the neighborhood. I appreciated the gesture, and we exchanged small talk for a few minutes. He asked the usual questions, like why I moved, where I came from, and whether I lived with anyone. In the context of being a new neighbor, none of it seemed odd. Martin mentioned he lived with his wife, Elaine, and that they both loved the peace and quiet of the neighborhood. After a short while, he left, and I went back to unpacking. He seemed like a decent man, just trying to be neighborly. He was probably 20 or 30 years older than me, so I knew we weren't going to become close friends. But it was reassuring to know someone friendly was nearby. Over the next few days, I got more settled in. I took some walks around the neighborhood, just trying to get used to the area. But something about it felt strange. I couldn't help noticing that I never saw anyone outside. No neighbors in their yards, no kids playing, no one sitting on porches. The place felt hollow, almost lifeless, and it made me feel out of place. It was depressing in a way. One afternoon, around 4 o'clock, Martin stopped by again. He told me that he and his wife were hosting a dinner that night at 7:30 with several of the other neighbors, and he thought it would be a perfect opportunity for me to meet everyone. I was surprised because from what I'd seen, it seemed like everyone kept to themselves. Still, this felt like my only chance to meet people, so I accepted his invitation. He smiled and said he looked forward to seeing me later, then left. When 7:30 came, I got ready and walked over to his house. The neighborhood was silent and dark, giving me that same hollow feeling I'd been noticing, almost like I was completely alone in the world. When I reached Martin's place, it looked just as dark and inactive. No cars outside, no sound of activity. The front door was slightly open, but I knocked anyway. Immediately, Martin's voice called from inside, telling me to come in and make myself at home. His voice echoed strangely through the house, and it was unusually quiet inside. I stepped in cautiously. The lighting was dim, shadows filled the rooms, and the whole place had a moody atmosphere. I walked toward the kitchen, following where I thought his voice came from, but when I got there, it was empty. Martin wasn't there. I called his name, then called for Elaine, but got no response. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The kitchen was completely bare, no food, no table set, no sign of any kind of dinner or gathering. That's when it hit me. No one else was here. Suddenly, I heard the front door slam shut. My heart jumped. I quickly called Martin's name again, but the only thing that answered was silence. I walked back down the hallway and saw the front door was now closed. A wave of dread rushed through me. I hurried toward it, but as I reached for the handle, I heard slow, heavy footsteps from one of the rooms behind me. Fear rushed into my chest. I didn't dare look back. I just moved faster to the door. When I tried it, I realized it was locked in 3 different places. This wasn't an accident. As I fumbled with the locks, Martin's voice called my name again. But this time, it sounded different, deeper, harsher, with no friendliness at all. I could hear his footsteps coming closer, faster, and his tone grew darker with every word he spoke. Panic took over, but I managed to undo the last lock, yank the door open, and run straight back to my house. I locked myself inside and grabbed my phone. I debated whether I should really call the police, but I knew I had to. Within minutes of me making it home, Martin came to my door, banging violently and even peering through my windows. I stayed hidden until, finally, he left. The police arrived after he was gone. When they questioned me and checked into his story, the truth came out. There was no dinner party. There was no wife named Elaine. Martin had lived alone in that house for over a decade. Every single thing he had told me was a lie, carefully made up just to get me comfortable enough to walk into his home. But the worst part? The police couldn't do anything about it. There was no proof of his intentions, no crime they could charge him with. Everyone, including the officers, knew it was far too strange for him to be completely innocent. But the law wasn't on my side. Not too long ago, I rented a small apartment in a complex on the edge of Brookdale City. At first, it seemed like the perfect place. Quiet, simple, and affordable. The building had 3 floors, and my unit was on the second. I didn't know many people in the area, but I figured I'd eventually meet my neighbors as time went by. About a week after moving in, I started noticing the man in the unit right across from mine. His name was Caleb, a guy probably in his late 30s. At first, he seemed normal enough, quiet, polite, when we crossed paths in the hallway, but not overly friendly. Still, something about him gave me an uneasy feeling that I couldn't explain. As days went on, I realized Caleb was always watching. Every time I stepped outside my door, I would catch him glancing at me through the peephole in his door. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid, but then I started to notice his shadow under the doorframe, standing there motionless whenever I moved around in the hallway. Even when I came home late at night, his door would creak open, just enough for him to peek out, before slowly shutting again. Things escalated one night when I returned home from work. As I was unlocking my door, I realized Caleb was standing directly behind me in the hallway. I hadn't heard him come out. He just stood there silently, staring with this strange half-smile on his face. I nervously said hello, but he didn't respond. He only tilted his head slightly, then turned and went back into his apartment. That encounter shook me to my core. After that, I began noticing more disturbing behavior, sometimes in the middle of the night. I would hear faint noises in the hallway, like slow footsteps right outside my door. Once, I even heard the sound of someone softly pressing on the doorknob, testing if it was locked. I stayed frozen in my bed until the noises stopped. But the worst night came when I was alone in my living room watching TV. I heard the sound of a faint scratching. At first, I thought it was coming from the walls, but then I realized it was coming from my front door. My heart pounded as I muted the television. The scratching turned into a light tapping, and then, unmistakably, I saw the shadow of 2 feet standing right outside. I tiptoed closer, trying not to make a sound, and that's when I saw it. Caleb's eye pressed against the crack under the door, staring in at me. I froze in terror. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I waited, and eventually the shadow pulled away. A minute later, I heard his door across the hall creak open and shut. I knew then that I wasn't safe. The next morning, I went straight to the apartment manager and explained everything. They seemed concerned, but they told me their hands were tied unless I had proof, or unless he actually did something illegal. I also contacted the police, but the response was frustratingly similar. Without hard evidence, there was nothing they could do. For the next week, I lived in constant fear. Every sound in the hallway made me jump. Every time I came home, I dreaded running into him. And then, one night, it all came to a breaking point. I woke up at around 3 a.m. to the sound of my doorknob rattling violently. Someone was trying to break in. I jumped up, grabbed the heaviest object I could find, and stood frozen in the dark, staring at the door. The rattling stopped, and then came loud bangs, like someone throwing their shoulder against it. I screamed out, telling them I was calling the police. Suddenly, everything went silent. I waited in the darkness, clutching the object in my hands, until I finally heard footsteps retreating down the hallway and a door slamming shut. I called the police immediately. This time, when they arrived, they found marks all around my doorknob and frame, clear evidence that someone had been trying to force their way in. They questioned Caleb, but of course, he denied everything. Without catching him in the act, they couldn't arrest him. I didn't wait for things to get worse. The very next day, I packed up what I could and moved out of that building. I never looked back. To this day, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't woken up in time, or if the locks hadn't held. The thought of Caleb standing outside my door in the middle of the night, watching me, waiting for the right moment, it still haunts me. When I was 24, I moved into a mid-sized apartment building in a quiet part of Ashwood City. The building wasn't fancy, but it was affordable, and it felt like a fresh start for me. My unit was on the second floor, directly across from another apartment whose door was always decorated with different wreaths and notes taped up. It gave me the impression that whoever lived there liked attention. A few days after I moved in, I met her, the neighbor across the hall. She introduced herself as Mrs. Caldwell, a woman in her mid-40s with shoulder-length black hair and a forced smile that never seemed to fade. She was overly cheerful, the kind of person who talked too much and too quickly. At first, I thought she was just being friendly. She welcomed me to the building and said if I ever needed anything, I could knock on her door any time. At first, her friendliness seemed harmless, but soon it turned into something that felt invasive. Every single time I came home, she would appear at her door within seconds, as if she had been waiting for me. She'd ask me endless questions: where I worked, who I spent time with, when I usually came and went. At first, I answered politely, but eventually I started giving vague responses just to keep her from prying. It didn't stop there. Mrs. Caldwell started knocking on my door almost daily. Sometimes she'd bring over cookies or claim she had leftovers she didn't want to waste. Other times she'd invent reasons, like asking to borrow something simple, salt, flour, or even tape, things she clearly had at her own place. I tried being polite, but it became obvious she was more interested in forcing her way into my life than actually needing anything. One night, she knocked again, this time asking me to come over for dinner. I declined, telling her I was busy. She didn't hide her disappointment, and her smile faltered for the first time. After that, her behavior grew stranger. She started calling me by name through the door late at night, sometimes at 1 or 2 in the morning. I would hear her voice in the hallway asking if I was awake, asking if I wanted to join her for a drink. I never answered, and I would sit frozen in silence until she eventually walked away. The final straw came one evening when I was in my bedroom reading. Suddenly, I heard my apartment door open. My blood ran cold. I knew I'd locked it. I quietly got up and peeked around the corner, and there she was. Mrs. Caldwell was inside my apartment, standing near the entryway, holding a kitchen knife. My hand shook as I shouted at her, demanding to know what she was doing. She gave me the same eerie smile and said she just wanted to talk, that she hated how distant I had been lately. She took a small step forward, still holding the knife loosely in her hand. I grabbed my phone and threatened to call the police immediately. Her expression changed in an instant. She froze, then turned and bolted out of my apartment without another word. I locked the door and dialed 911 right away. When the police arrived, they searched for her, but she had already retreated into her own apartment. They questioned her, but she claimed she had only come by to check on me, denying everything about the knife. Without physical evidence, there wasn't much they could do beyond filing a report. I didn't sleep at all that night. The very next morning, I made arrangements to leave that building. I moved out within a week, breaking my lease just to get away from her. To this day, I still replay that moment in my head, the sight of her stepping into my apartment, knife in hand, smiling as if it was the most natural thing in the world. I often wonder what would have happened if I hadn't seen her in time, or if I hadn't reacted the way I did. The thought still chills me. Mrs. Caldwell wasn't just a strange neighbor. She was something far more dangerous.